When you hear the name Valley Forge, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably a frozen, starving army, right? Guys on the absolute brink of collapse. And look, that's definitely true, but it's really only half the story. Because the Brook that marched into that winter camp was not the same army that marched out. Today, we're going to explore how this crucible of unbelievable suffering actually forged a nation's army.
And this is not some dramatic exaggeration. This is a direct quote from General George Washington himself, describing his own men. It just paints this immediate, brutal picture of what the Continental Army was going through as they stumbled into their winter quarters. It was a moment of absolute, total desperation.
And let's be really clear about this. The entire cause for independence was hanging by a thread. The army was demoralized, the British had captured the capital city, Philadelphia, and a lot of people were wondering if the whole revolution was about to just flicker out in the cold Pennsylvania hills. So how did they even find themselves in this mess? Well, this wasn't some kind of planned strategic move. Nope. This was a retreat born from failure and pure necessity. So let's take a look at the events that led them to this incredibly desperate place. The fall of 1777 was frankly a disaster for the Continental Army. After a really stinging defeat at the Battle of Brandywine, they were completely powerless to stop the British from just marching right into Philadelphia, which was the revolutionary capital. Washington's 12,000 soldiers had to find a place, any place, to lick their wounds and just try to survive the winter. What's so interesting is why they chose this specific spot. They didn't pick Valley Forge because it had, warm buildings waiting for them. Not at all. They chose it because it was on high, defensible ground, about 18 miles from where the British were cozy in Philadelphia. It was a strategic post to watch the enemy and stop them from raiding the countryside for supplies. Survival, not comfort, was the one and only goal. And just surviving was going to be an immense challenge. You can really understand the 6 months at Valley Forge as a battle against three huge, overlapping crises that almost destroyed the army from the inside. A total lack of shelter, rampant disease, and starvation. Just try to imagine this. You arrive at this frozen, windswept plateau with basically nothing. The soldiers had to build their own shelters. We're talking between 1,500 and 2,000 crude log huts, dug into the frozen ground, often with leaky roofs that did almost nothing to keep out the wet and the cold. The French officer Lafayette called them dungeons, and he was not kidding. And this number, this is the stark, brutal reality of that winter. Around 2,000 soldiers died at Valley Forge. To put that in perspective, that's more men that died in many of the war's biggest battles. This was a battlefield of a totally different kind, and the enemy was invisible, striking from inside the camp itself. Now, this is a really common misconception. We all picture soldiers freezing to death in the snow. And while the weather was absolutely miserable, often more wet and raw than just snowy, the real killers were things like typhoid, dysentery, and influenza. These diseases just ran wild because of poor sanitation, contaminated water, and thousands of men crammed into those dungeon-like huts. And making the disease problem even worse was a crippling supply crisis. On paper, the daily ration seems okay, right? But the reality? A totally broken supply chain, neglect from Congress, and impassable winter roads meant supplies almost never got there. Soldiers would go for days with no meat at all, surviving on something called fire cakes, which was just this disgusting paste of flour and water cooked on a hot rock. Washington saw what was happening with terrifying clarity. In this desperate letter he wrote to Congress, he laid out the grim options. He knew that without a great and capital change, as he put it, the army would just cease to exist. This was the absolute lowest point of the entire war. But it's in the deepest darkness that you can often see the stars. Just as the army was about to completely break, some key individuals stepped up and began to transform this place of suffering into a forge, hammering out a brand new kind of army. Really, 3 men were absolutely essential to this turnaround. Washington, of course, whose unshakable leadership just held the whole thing together. Then there was Nathaniel Greene, one of the Army's best generals, who reluctantly took over as quartermaster and somehow started to fix the supply nightmare. And then there was Baron von Steuben, a professional soldier from Prussia who was about to change everything. The genius of von Steuben was his method. He didn't just hand out a book of instructions. He personally took 100 men and drilled them himself over and over until they were perfect. This model company then spread out, teaching their fellow soldiers.
So for the first time, the entire army was learning the same drills, the same movements, and crucially, how to actually use a bayonet, turning it from a cooking tool into a deadly weapon.
And while von Steuben was busy training the army to fight the British, Washington was fighting that other enemy, disease. He figured out which of his soldiers hadn't been inoculated against smallpox, a huge killer back then, and he ordered it done immediately for thousands of them. This was one of the first large-scale, state-sponsored immunization campaigns in history. It saved countless lives. So what's the end result? Well, the transformation was just dramatic. The collection of separate state militias that walked into Valley Forge was reborn. They now moved as one unit, they thought as one, and they fought as one. They had become a professional, disciplined army, ready to take on the best in the world. So as spring finally arrived, bringing with it better supplies and better health, something else showed up. Something that would change the course of the entire war and just electrify the camp with a kind of hope they hadn't felt in a very long time. See, while the army was suffering at Valley Forge, American diplomats were working hard over in Europe. That stunning victory at Saratoga the year before had finally convinced France to officially join the war on the American side. When news of this powerful new ally finally reached the camp in May, it was like a lightning bolt, completely revitalizing the weary soldiers. The entire army just erupted in a massive celebration. They showed off their new drills for Washington with incredible pride. They fired their muskets and cannons in a rolling salute, and they gave these 3 thunderous cheers. They weren't alone anymore. The tide of the war had finally turned. And so, on June 19th, 6 months to the day after they had limped into that camp, a new army marched out. And they weren't retreating anymore. Oh no. This time, they were on the offensive, chasing after the British, who were actually abandoning Philadelphia. And the real test? It came just days after leaving camp, at the Battle of Monmouth. This transformed army met the British in open battle, and for hours in blistering heat, they stood their ground, trading fire with one of the finest armies in the world. They proved, right there on the battlefield, that the training and discipline forged at Valley Forge was the real deal. So that leaves us with this final question. We all remember Valley Forge for the bloody footprints in the snow, for the starvation, for the disease. But maybe its true legacy isn't just about endurance. Perhaps it should be remembered as the very place where a suffering mob was transformed into the professional army that would go on to win American independence. A true testament to resilience and the birth of a nation's fighting spirit.